in this Living Lab project, we've got a bunch of partners, basically everybody who's working on environmental issues in Manitoba as part of this Living Lab project. So the Living Lab project, there are sites across Canada basically that are research sites. So they're Ag Canada scientists and other scientists working with producers on field scale kind of projects. So one of the projects is the Swan Lake Watershed. I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's in the kind of the upper western prairie ecosystem, ecozone. It represents different parts of Manitoba, but that's where these scientists are working, and they're working on field scale with problems that producers have. Basically kind of that area between, you know, production and the environment. How can we farm in a way that has less impact on the environment? And, you know, pollinators are one of those aspects that we're working on. And through these sessions, these webinars, we hope to raise the level of education and so that everybody understands how, you know, they could play a part. And we're going to learn through this process. So thank you for joining us. I'm joined by Melissa Grantham with Nature Conservancy. She's kind of our lead on this Living Lab project with pollinators and habitat. And I mentioned Melanie Dubois, she'll be coming on later. But with that, welcome Melissa Grantham.
All right. So yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Melissa Grantham. I'm a conservation biologist with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I've been with them for about 7.5 years. And as Cliff mentioned, I am co-lead with Cliff on the pollinator piece of the Living Labs project, and also working with Melanie Dubois. We also have a couple of other staff at NCC in our Manitoba region who are involved in this pollinator project. Rebecca Neufeld, she is our conservation science manager, and Stephen Anderson, who is also a conservation biologist, and he's sort of working on some of our pollinator habitat connectivity pieces. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're linked in with the Living Labs sort of at the end of my presentation. But I just wanted to start out, for those of you who don't know who NCC are or who maybe don't know a whole lot about us, I just kind of wanted to give you an intro to our organization. So Nature Conservancy of Canada is a land conservation organization. We are nonprofit, so we're not a government organization. And we are Canada's leading national land conservation organization. We have offices all across the country, from Atlantic all the way to the West Coast. We work in partnership with private individuals, with corporations, and with governments to directly protect significant natural areas. And in the 55 years that we've been around, we've conserved over 2.8 million acres in Canada, and we now own and manage over 1,100 properties. So NCC's mission, our primary mission, is to conserve important and natural areas and biological diversity in Canada. So in Manitoba, we have 9 of these natural areas that we work in, and I've got a map coming up to show those to you. So our primary sort of, we call them pillars, but our primary sort of core activities that we conduct in order to follow with our mission is science, securement, and stewardship. So using the most sort of up-to-date and available information and science, it helps NCC to identify priority areas for our work across the country. Through our securement programming, we work with local landowners to protect habitat through direct purchases or free simple purchases, land donations, as well as conservation easements. And our stewardship activities, it's a pretty big program for us. It's a pretty big piece of our work, and it's related to the long-term management of secured properties. So NCC uses a landscape-based conservation approach. So considerations given to the entire landscape, as well as large blocks of land that support the greatest diversity of species and ecosystems. So we sort of have this scaled down approach, right? So we work at the ecoregion level, And then down at the natural area level, we have natural area conservation plans, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then we also work down at the property level, planning and stewarding individual properties. So as I had mentioned, currently NCC works in 9 priority natural areas in Manitoba. And you can see those here on the map outlined in green. So we do work pretty much right across the province, but we're kind of focused down in the southern part of the province. So within each of our natural areas, NCC develops what we call natural area conservation plans, which are plans that are developed for a region on a 10-year scale. They examine the most at-risk species and ecosystems, the threats to those, and then those plans set out strategies to ensure the long-term conservation success within that area. Yeah, and we also do a similar planning process at the property level. The documents that we develop at the property level are called a property management plan. So those would include very, very similar types of information to the plans that we develop for the larger natural area. It's just they're on a more localized scale, looking at more sort of localized species and habitats. So some of the ways that we carry out stewardship in order to conserve biodiversity includes conservation management techniques to promote the maintenance of diversity of habitats and successional stages, as well as rare and endangered species that these habitats support. And this is all to achieve long-term maintenance of biodiversity. And these are often carried out in partnership with local producers and landowners, so grazing, haying, mowing, those kinds of activities, as well as prescribed fire. We do have a prescribed fire program within NCC. And without the active and regular management, using these land management techniques, these important habitats, especially endangered habitats like tallgrass prairie and mixed grass prairie, all grasslands, they'll become likely overgrown with shrubs and forest and lose that biodiversity and that important habitat for those specialized species. So the application of land management tools can be challenging in these landscapes for us, especially in those lands that are supporting multiple species at risk, or that require consideration, lands that require consideration of multiple conservation targets. So our management prescriptions are generally directed at the recovery of multiple species, as well as using an adaptive management approach where we continually come back together, look back on what we've learned and what we've done, and the knowledge that we've gained, and then wrapping that back into the our approach going forward. So in light of that, I just want to talk a little bit about NCC's involvement in Living Labs. Because Living Labs is such a broad scale program and does work within 4 watersheds that overlap with some of our natural areas. NCC is directly involved with the pollinator activity, as has been mentioned earlier. So we're working directly with the Watershed District, so directly with Cliff and with AAFC, so our contact there is Melanie, working together to try to improve the landscape for pollinator habitat. So trying to prioritize areas that have low connectivity. So, you know, pollinators need a certain amount of habitat to move around in and to live their life cycle in. And sometimes when the landscape becomes fragmented or broken up, the habitats that are left are no longer big enough for them. So we're trying to work on connecting up that habitat again. And, you know, working with producers and landowners to try and improve production on their lands, and also at the same time improving habitat for pollinators. And I'm really pleased that that we were able to do this today, and despite sort of our current situation, and we're really pleased that all of you are here to join us today. So I'm going to hand it off to Melanie.
So today, though, we're going to talk about pollinators, and we're going to talk about roadside vegetation management, which is a really fancy way of just saying how we're managing like the ditches and things like that. That one's kind of new, so we're pretty excited about that within the Living Labs, and we'll talk all about it as we go forward. So you've seen this map. Cliff put this up, talking a little bit about the Eastern Prairie Living Labs. It's kind of an exciting approach. I mean, I think maybe I get excited about funny things, but to me it's exciting because it's a new way of looking at agro ecosystems. One of the things that's different about it is that normally, you know, the researchers within Ag Canada, we think about, okay, what are the things we want to study? What do we think the questions are? That kind of thing. And then most of my colleagues do it on small plots. Some are more big plot kind of guys, but most on small plots. And then we sometimes find cooperators to help us out, and maybe a few partnerships. But the Living Labs, really the intent behind it was we took a look at what the priorities were for the partners and the ag groups and things like that. And then we went to producers and said, well, what questions do you have, right? Because what we're finding is that some of the research that we're doing, yeah, it's answering important questions, but it might not be as relevant as we want it to do. And it's not helping producers answer the questions they have that are standing in the way of them perhaps adopting some management practices because they're just not certain what the economic benefit is, or you know, there are other barriers. So, you know, Living Labs, we turn that around, and we are trying to design our research and the questions that we're answering around the questions that producers have. So Cliff, Melissa, I, and you know, there are a number of other people, we're focused on that biodiversity piece. So it has a few components to it, but what we're going to talk about today really is about the pollinators. And we're looking, as Melissa said, at that landscape mosaic and trying to increase the value of different beneficial management practices to biodiversity. It also feeds into a broader biodiversity monitoring network that we're hoping to set up in all the Living Labs, because we have a Living Lab in PEI, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and then one is being established in BC. So we're going to take that opportunity to do some of this standardized monitoring all across Canada and try and answer some of those questions that we have on what ag's impact on biodiversity is going forward. So it's, you know, part of a larger piece, which is kind of nice for us to be looking at what other people are doing, what other producers in other areas find important, and try and tie that all together. So in that monitoring network, we are going to be looking at beneficial insects. We're going to be looking at birds, plants, soil, arthropods, that type of thing. So it should be exciting. We'll talk more on that as we go. So we are going to focus today, though, on pollinators. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the species, a bit about the biology, habitat, perhaps the role of, you know, the role of pollinators, the role of their habitat to support pollinators. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about what we don't know and what we're hoping to learn either through this project or through partnering with other researchers in other areas. One of the things I get asked a lot about bees is why I focus on bees, because there are other pollinators, of course. There are butterflies, moths, flies, wasps. In other parts of the world, hummingbirds, bats, things like that all play a really key role. In our area, we do tend to focus on bees simply because they're what we call obligate pollinators. Throughout their whole life cycle, they eat pollen and nectar, they feed it to their young, they visit the same flowers based on who they evolved with, some of their anatomical features, do they have a long tongue, a short tongue, that type of thing. So not only are they one of our most important pollinators, but they're also you know, a little bit easier to study, and the flowers are more important to them because, for example, butterflies and moths, they are a caterpillar for a really long time. So their larval host plant becomes really critical, and they tend not to eat pollen and nectar when they're a caterpillar, of course. Now flies, they eat anything. Wasps are a little bit more of an omnivore. So that's why we tend to focus on bees. And I'm going to address the fact that most of my talk, well, quite frankly, all of my talk is about wild bees. We don't really address the issues with domestic bees. And I'll talk a little bit about why we leave those to a whole other crew of experts. So beyond getting asked why I focus on bees, I also get asked, okay, well, what's really going on with bees? You know, because there's a lot out in the news, right? And sometimes it's hard to pick out what's really going on. So that's what I get asked when I'm standing at a booth. It's like, okay, what's really going on? Or when my mother-in-law sees something in the news, she calls me up and says, well, I saw this, what does this mean? And it's great because those questions are really important for us to be able to focus the information that we're giving to people. So I like to throw this slide up because it kind of gives it all in one slide. Basically, the status of bees is declining. Some species of bees are not declining as quickly. We don't really know why, but basically all the bees, in fact, all insects are declining. We've seen about a 70% reduction overall in aerial insect biomass, which is really concerning because, of course, they're kind of the bottom of the pyramid, right? Or pretty close to the bottom of the pyramid, where so many other organisms rely on them as food. And as we've lost that insect biomass, we're losing things like, you know, grassland birds. All kinds of things are linked to that. So overall, their status populations are going down. The trend in their decline is pretty steadily downwards. Some species of bee, not as much. We don't really know why some bees that used to be really common are rare, and then other bees that have similar life histories we're not seeing the same decline in that. So, you know, more research is needed on that, but overall trend is down. So the drivers of those are, we're getting better at understanding what those drivers are, and I'll talk about those throughout my discussion here today. Because I know at some point people were talking about, you know, is it cell phone towers? Is it things like that? And we didn't really understand that. And of course, no, it's not cell phone towers. Some of the questions around drivers, we don't understand which ones are more important in certain areas to certain species. But again, we're starting to figure that out. The really important thing on that slide being thresholds, we really don't have any idea what our thresholds are. And a threshold is generally, okay, how badly can we impact that population before we start to see significant impacts on things like food production? We're already seeing those impacts, right? And I'll talk about those as well. We don't really understand the threshold that we can get down to before we're really in trouble. Although in other parts of the world, they have reached those thresholds already. There are provinces in China where they hand pollinate pear crops and things like that with chicken feathers because they simply do not have the pollinators anymore. That could be really concerning because could you imagine the scale of agriculture we have trying to hand pollinate crops would be problematic, to say the least. So that threshold question really is still out there, and we may never know that, unfortunately, until we've crossed it, but hopefully we don't get there. So I mentioned that I'm going to talk about wild bees, and one of the things when I started working on this topic, well, it might have been 10 years ago, is that even I had a lot to learn. I'll be frank with you guys. I call myself sort of a fake entomologist because I'm relatively new to the subject. I was in school for 10 years and took a million different kinds of ologies, histology, biology, osteology, every kind of taxonomy, lower invertebrate zoology, all that kind of stuff. Didn't take entomology, partially because I don't like crickets. They're kind of super gross. So yeah, so this has been a new topic to me, and I've learned lots. And so through my learning process too, and talking to people, I find that people don't know a lot about bees, which is kind of exciting because it gives us an opportunity to tell people things that everyone thinks is super cool. But also it has some challenges that people don't know a lot about bees. Generally, I find people think there are about two kinds of bees, right? Honeybees and bumblebees. And there are far more than honeybees and bumblebees. But I don't blame people, right? I mean, I didn't really know how many species we had. And oftentimes in the media, they focus so much on honeybees. You know, there was a study where they looked at articles on bees, and, you know, 15% or fewer articles actually talked about wild bees. And that's important because the pressures on our different kinds of bees are different, and they have very different solutions. So I'm going to address that coming up. For school groups, we go through a whole exercise teaching people how to identify bees, and who knows if people are interested. One of my students, Emily, she's a grad student at U of M, did a fantastic talk on identifying different types of bees, which is kind of cool. Anyway, but I have lots of cool pictures on here too, so you can take a look as we go. The number of bees that we have in Manitoba, the number has actually gone up since I started looking at this. It's not because we actually have more bees. What it is our capacity to identify them has gotten better. There's a researcher, Dr. Jason Gibbs. He's essentially like the world expert on North American bees. He's a fantastic resource for us on this project, and the work that he's been doing here in Manitoba and with other researchers has been fantastic. So yeah, when I started, the number we threw around was about 218. We're well past 350 now, so I just say plus. Yeah, the bumblebees have stayed pretty stable. We have about 24 species of bumblebee. They look very similar, which is why I put this grouping up here, because yeah, they look the same until you start looking at various parts of them to see that they are in fact different bees. But worldwide, we have almost 20,000 species of bee. Down in the US, 3,600, and here in Canada, upwards of 800 species of bees. So it's really quite neat once you start sticking them under the microscope and taking a look at them. I think their faces are beautiful. So, I'm a little biased. So talking about honeybees, and now the proper name for them is European honeybees. And one thing I want people to understand is that they are actually not endangered here in North America. Actually, their numbers are going up. That's not to say that they don't have challenges, because they do. Things with disease and pathogen transmission is really critical for them. They are influenced by the lack of diverse habitat around the agricultural crops where they're placed, so that becomes an issue. But for example, in Manitoba, honeybees are considered livestock under the Agricultural Act because we take care of them, right? And when we need more honeybees, we produce more honeybees. But again, like I said, that's not to say that they are not experiencing problems. They do, experience some of those same pressures that our wild bees have. But the solution to the honeybee issue is different than the solution to the wild bee issue. And European honeybees were not native to North America. They came over with the settlers. So the issues where they are originally from, become more similar to our wild bees here. So this slide is just to really illustrate and, help you understand that honeybees came from Europe. They live on farms here. One thing that people are often shocked by is that honeybees are the only species of bee that commercially make honey. And they're the only ones that live in hives. Our wild bees don't produce honey, and most of them are solitary. So, it's a little bit different perspective. So I tell people, try and think of honeybees like cows, sheep, goats, things like that. Whereas our wild bees are unfortunately sometimes like polar bears in that their populations are in peril. Some of them are a little bit more like deer and elk, a little more populous. So we have about 80% of our bees in Manitoba are actually ground nesting bees. And this can be a challenge, right? When you think about agriculture, we do a lot of tilling, right? Less so than we used to, but ground nesting bees, and I'll talk about their habitat requirements, really need that undisturbed land, which can be hard to come by. About 20% of our bees are stem or wood nesting bees. So they are in like hollowed out reeds, old branches, sort of punky wood, things like that. That's why one of the hats I wear is I'm one of the co-founders of Bee City Brandon. And we tell people, you know, don't clean up your yard, because when you cut down those old branches and burn them and stuff, you're burning all the bees that are in there waiting for next summer. So that's a whole other talk. Bumblebees, they're kind of super cool. They're only about 1% of our population, and they are kind of ground nesters, but they usually use like old mouse nests, sort of thatchy patches of grass, or in like the base of a tree, things like that. And they have wax, not the same as like a hive. I've got a good picture coming up. And yeah, so they're a little bit different. I give a whole talk on bumblebees, but we're going to skip over them a little bit. So this slide shows you what some of the ground nesting burrows look like. If you look in the upper left, you've probably seen these all over the place and assume that they were anthills. Next summer, when you're standing around, you got some time on your hands, just watch them a bit, because ants tend to go in and out, you know, pretty frequently. If you don't see an ant coming in and out, then chances are it's a ground nesting bee. So as I mentioned, most of them are solitary, but they tend to aggregate in certain areas because they're looking for well-drained, sort of sandy soil that has a bit of clay in it, so it holds together. So you tend to get them aggregating in one area. Oh, there's this poor lady. She's over by, I want to say by Portage. Anyway, all of a sudden, their yard became incredibly attractive to this certain Lasioglossum. It's sort of a mid-sized bee, like smaller than a honeybee. They don't sting. Most of our native bees don't sting and are not aggressive. But she had thousands and thousands of them, and they were just everywhere. And I felt so bad for her. They tried for so long to come up with a solution to it. They ended up putting grass over the area and doing some other things to it to try and dissuade them, because their grandkids couldn't play out there, everything. But you know, that's like one time out of like a million. But they do tend to aggregate in areas. So you'll notice that there are two sort of styles there. One where they're all laid sort of like in a straw. And what's interesting is that the ones that are laid first, of course, emerge later. The female eggs tend to be closer to the surface. They come out first, and then the males come out later. The other one shows multiple chambers where they have like a little separate spot for each of their larvae. They don't really take care of them the same way that that honeybees do. Again, they're solitary, so what they tend to do is put together a little ball that they call bee bread with pollen and nectar. And that's kind of cool because certain bees like certain types of flowers to make their pollen balls, and they also like different consistencies to them. So some like soupy bread, some like drier. So it just depends on that species, but that's what it looks like below ground, which I think is kind of neat. So I mentioned, you know, we've got the above ground nesters, about 20% of them. A common one that people would be familiar with are leafcutter beets. That's a megachile. So that is a wild bee that's been used, you know, and domesticated for quite some time. You know, you see their huts all over the place. Anyone that's grown alfalfa seed knows what those critters do. They're really quite neat. And yeah, they put them in straws. Here, I'll flip to my next slide here, which I think is kind of cool. That shows how they're arranged within their cells. So it mentions there that they're partitioned with different types of material. You know, leaf cutter bees. They use leaves. Some bees are super cute. They even use petals off of flowers, things like that. Mason bees use mud. You know, when you think about it, about that stat, that it can take, you know, more than 1,000 trips to a flower to make enough bee bread to provision 1 egg and 1 larvae. So this becomes important when you start talking about fragmentation of habitat and how far that bee needs to travel to get the resources it needs to provision its cells. If you're doing 1,000 trips back and forth to a grocery store, you really don't want that trip to be very long, right? The longer it is, the more chances are you're going to get hurt on that trip, and it takes you just longer so you can have fewer young. So that's how this all kind of ties together, and we'll make reference to that as we go. I mentioned that bumblebees have a really cool life cycle. They don't live in hives, but they're what's called eusocial, in that they live in family groups. Depending on on how good the resources are in the area, you might have upwards of 50, which when you think about it, the average honeybee hive can have up to 50,000. So the life strategies are quite a bit different for a native bee versus a honeybee, right? Because honeybees can be more aggressive, they can take more chances in trying to get resources and things like that. Because if one bee dies, big deal, you had a bajillion left to help to provision and their young and things like that. But if the mother bee or the queen bee of a solitary bee or a bumblebee is killed or damaged in some way, then really that whole nest either can sometimes die completely or may not be as successful because perhaps she only had time to do a few cells before she was killed off. But yeah, bumblebees, they make these little wax cups, and the queens are the fertilized daughters from the year before. They do hibernate over the winter. So in the spring, when you're seeing those really big chunky bees flying around, those are all queen bumblebees, and they're looking for a nest, and then they'll start to lay eggs. And the first ones that come out are sterile daughters, and then they start to help the queen raise the young, and then the last to emerge are males and fertile daughters. And they kind of disperse and then do what bees do, and the fertilized daughters survive. They hibernate over winter, which is why I tell people to leave your leaves in your flower beds and don't disturb them, because they'll burrow down in there, and that leaf layer is really important for insulation and moderating those temperatures in the spring when it's getting freeze thaw, etc. And then they'll emerge and start all over again. The males and the queens from the year before will all die before wintertime. So I think that's kind of cool. Speaking of dying, we die, we're taking you all with us. Just as an aside, I do give talks to grade schools and things like that. I've learned to take that slide out. This poor little girl looked at me, what, we're all gonna die? And I'm like, I'm sorry, no, we're not gonna die, it's supposed to be a joke. Kids don't think that's a joke. And really, in a lot of respects, it's not. People have probably seen on the internet, that quote, oh, Albert Einstein said, if the bees go, we're dead within 4 years. That's not true on any level. He didn't say it. They can't find anything where he ever talked about bees. And we wouldn't go in 4 years. That's for sure. But the bees are in decline. 1 in 4 bumblebees at risk of extinction. We've listed one federally, the rusty patch bumblebee. There was quite a bit in the press about that particular one because it was listed down in the States, I think maybe 2 years ago. We did it in, about 8-10 years ago. And then we have 6 species that are in consideration. for listing, which is, you know, really concerning as you're losing these species. These are the ones we know about, right? Because they perhaps have enough data to be studied and have been studied long enough for us to see the trends and document them to the point where we meet the threshold to list them. But there would be lots of bees. We just have no idea, right, where they are, where they're at in their populations. So we're hoping through studies like the Living Labs, where we're doing baselines in Manitoba, that we can increase our understanding of what's going on to guide what we're doing with our programs and policies on that. So no, we might not be dead in 4 years, but man, they're important. They're important to us. About 60%, or pardon me, 70% of the 124 main crops are insect pollinated. So that's almost 40% of food crop production. What's interesting is that, yeah, there are a lot of crops that don't require insect pollination, but the really important ones that are very nutrient dense, you know, with vitamins, minerals, etc., come from those insect pollinated plants. And the value of insect pollination to agriculture is significant. You know, 3 billion a year in Canada, you know, almost 30 billion in the US, 217 billion worldwide. You know, the numbers really start to add up. And you know, they're very critical to our food supply. So without enough pollinators, sure, yeah, we'd survive, but food scarcity and insecurity would be a real issue, because we would lose a lot of those real nutrient rich foods. Some people enjoy coffee or chocolate. You pretty much not have a lot of those, which makes some people panic. It's interesting when looking at agriculture's dependency on insect pollinated crops, because it's increasing significantly. You know, we do talk about changing diets as different developing countries change their eating habits. We've seen an increase of like a doubling in crop acres on those insect pollinated crops. There have also been a number of studies looking at how vulnerable our agricultural systems are to the loss of pollinators, and we're right up there because we do a lot of edible oil crops, fruits, vegetables, things like that. But we're looking at, we tied for about 4th out of 16 major regions, ag regions and ag producers, to vulnerability to loss. And when we're looking at yields associated with insect pollinated crops, one thing that's interesting is that we've seen a lot of innovations, right, that have increased our yields over time, either changes to fertilizers or you know, breeding programs, both with Ag Canada and then the other agricultural companies have really changed our yields. Yeah, technology, all kinds of things. But those yield increases from those innovations just have been lower in those crops that are insect pollinated, because we just simply can't dig ourselves out of the hole that we're creating when it comes to you know, reducing our pollinator populations. We just simply can't overcome that through our innovations. And I'll tell you why, going down the road here, that we also can't overcome those deficits using honeybees. As I mentioned, they have their own challenges, but also they are not particularly good pollinators for a lot of the crops that we do grow. So we do, yeah, I mentioned we have our highest dependencies with oil crops, you know, canola, things like that. We don't do a lot of coffee and chocolate here, but around the world, those things, nuts, spices, etc., need those insect pollinators. There are a number of studies that have been going on. I just pulled 2 real recent ones. These are just from 2020. A large study looked at different crops down in the States and found overall, yeah, we're seeing those deficits, right? We're seeing that yields are going down for reasons that cannot be explained by anything other than the loss of our pollinators They also looked at the contribution of wild bees versus honeybees, and of course found, to surprise to no one who studies these insects, that you know, wild bees out-pollinate by a factor of 1.4 to 3.2, depending on your type of crop. They're just much better, and of course, why wouldn't they be, right? Think of it this way: when you're building a house or something, you need a lot of different tools, a lot of different, you know, you need screws, you need nails, you need all kinds of different things. A honeybee is just one species and cannot be expected to make up for the entire suite of over 350 different sizes of bees with different pollen structures and habitats and habits. So yeah, honeybees can't do it all. They're just one tool in the toolbox. This was an interesting study that looked at, this was done in Alberta, Paul Galperin and his crew out there. And yeah, they looked at over 250,000 kilometers of cropland from 2012 to 2017. And what they were looking for is they wanted to see in the areas where they have potholes and shelter belts and all this kind of stuff, sort of these more complex landscapes, as opposed to a more uniform crop, what's the impact on crop yields? You know, because intuitively they believe that, well, other studies have shown when you have more bees in the area, your crops increase. But one of the, you know, there are a number of concerns that producers have with having potholes, etc. on there. Some have to do with, are these acting as refugia for pests? Or, you know, do I really see a benefit from these pollinators? Are they actually going out into my fields? And they did see that it was positively associated with crop yields, right? So in those areas over multiple years with many different types of crops, that increase was present. It was small, you know, it ranged to like 3, 4, up to 7%, things like that. Sometimes though, when the margins are low, if you're looking at that, you're seeing a 7% increase for something that isn't taking away from your overall productivity, that can be really important, right? Because if we're trying to promote the retention of semi-natural vegetation for other purposes, say carbon sequestration or biodiversity refugia or erosion control, things like that, we want to make sure that what we're recommending doesn't have adverse effects for crop production. So you might not see a huge bump, you know, that was documented in this particular study, but you're not seeing negatives, which is really important when you're thinking about how you're going to manage those systems and the benefits you get from, say, as I mentioned, carbon sequestration or erosion control or filtration of runoff and things like that. You're getting those benefits, which they didn't quantify within this. They were simply looking at crop yields, but we know it's not doing damage. Really important. It's kind of out of order, but yeah, dependency does vary, and we recognize that. So we know that that yield increases can't be the only benefit to having pollinators in your area, but they become really important with hybrid canola seed production, blueberries, fruit trees, squash and tomatoes. You know, they need buzz pollination, which means, of course, you need native bees because honeybees don't do that type of pollination. Here in Ag Canada, we first got into looking at pollinators. Actually, Mark Wannick was working with Laura Miranda, and she did a ton of stuff looking at yield in canola. And other people have continued that work as well, where they're seeing, you know, yield increases by as much as 46%, which can be really important. One of the things they found too is improvements in uniformity of seed set, which if you're looking at how you're gonna, you know, harvest these crops, you need that whole field to be ready at the same time, right? Certain systems see this bump more. Nitrogen limited systems, they seem to see that a little bit more. So that's important. And the ideal amount of habitat, we still don't really know how much is enough. but then the figure of 30% is often thrown around. The important thing to understand about that 30% is that what that means is that you can have 30% of your area in natural habitat to support your pollinators without impacting your bottom line, right? So that's critical to understand as well. And I'll talk about the different forms that that this habitat can take, but that's not taking 30% of your land out of production. It just means in the area. So shelter belts, roadways, all that type of stuff can be part of that 30%. Give a few more plugs for native bees. You know, as I've mentioned many times here, they are more efficient pollinators than honeybees. You know, they were designed for this climate, right? They're not from Europe. So they do forage earlier in the day. They'll go when it's wetter, when it's colder, you know, and you don't have to pay for hive rental fees. That's not as common in our area as it is in some, like that's very, you know, it's big business down in the States. Billions of dollars are spent moving around hives, but it's big business in BC with the orchards and blueberry production. It's big business in Ontario, things like that. And what they're finding though is that you need your native pollinators in those areas because again, they just are more reliable than honeybees. And you get these other benefits, right, from these other ecological goods and services of those natural areas, not just the pollinators. I feel like I'm kind of hammering on this a lot, but you know, I'm a big fan of native bees. They're just better at it. This particular stat about vegetable gardening, when we were talking with some horticultural groups, was really important because when you see a reduction in wild bees, you see almost an exact corresponding loss in dollar value and yield to your vegetables because they are so critical. And again, they're just much better at it. Now, Cliff mentioned that he's going to be sending out a questionnaire, and this was a lot easier to get people to do when we were face-to-face. But I'd really like you to give some thought to this question and perhaps fill out that questionnaire because we want to know from you. Like, why do you think this issue is important to your operation or to the broader environment if you yourself aren't a producer? You know, I've tried to build the case here for why they're important, but we're interested in knowing from you what you think about this issue and why you think that they are important. So I'll have a few of these slides through the presentation just as a prompt for you guys to think about that and perhaps fill out that questionnaire. So I mentioned that we're getting a handle on the drivers of the decline. And these really are the top ones. It's climate change, pesticides, habitat loss and fragmentation, and disease and parasite transmission from managed bees. You know, I mentioned with honeybees, they have their issues with diseases and parasites, and unfortunately, they are passing those on to our wild bee populations, which becomes very serious in a number of ways, partially because, of course, we can't treat our wild bees, whereas they can treat managed bees or simply destroy the hive when the diseases or the parasites become out of control. Can't do that with our wild bees. So, and then they also act as a reservoir, right? If you do get your honeybee issue under control, well, they're just going to go out and mingle with the bees that they infected before. Becomes, you know, a cycle of that, which is not good. So climate change, sometimes when I talk about this particular driver, people, you know, you have an idea, well, it can't be too cold, it can't be too hot, but one of the important things has to do with when the plants that particular bee evolved with begins to bloom. And the fancy name for that, of course, is plant phenology. What we're seeing is that plants are blooming earlier or sometimes later, right? And different bees come out at different times of the year. They don't fly all year, although bumblebees are kind of nifty because they fly from April to even October. They're pretty hardy. But a lot of bees are, are just out for a very short period of time. So it's really important that the plant that they evolved with is available at that time. And some bees are generalists, so they can get away with a sort of a broader range, but other bees are pretty narrow. I mean, there's one in the Carberry Sandhills sort of area, a Macropis, that needs a particular native plant called yellow loosestrife, not like a purple loosestrife, which is, we know, bad, but they live on the oils of a yellow loosestrife, and that's really a precarious place to be when you're dependent that much on one particular species of native plant, because of course we're losing our native vegetation at an alarming rate as well. And so these things go hand in hand, that as the plants change when they bloom, the bee perhaps cannot keep up with that, and so they're missing their bloom time. And remember, I mentioned that they feed their young this bee bread, and they need certain types of plants sometimes to do that. And as those choices get narrower and narrower, the quality of that nutrition that they're either feeding themselves or their young goes down and becomes really important. Yeah, their distribution is changing. They're finding that that as the climate is getting warmer, going north, the bees are just not keeping up. There's something else that's holding them from adapting. We're seeing increased storms, right? They're flying, they're out there, and that impacts them as well. Early storms, later frost, all these things become an issue for them. I'm going to check. I don't believe I have anything on pesticides in here. It's a little bit of a cop-out, simply because that's not really my area of expertise. And oftentimes people have really, really detailed questions on those that I'm not comfortable addressing. We do know that neonates are banned in the EU, subject to some lawsuits on that, and our regulatory bodies are taking a look at that. And there was supposed to be a report out this fall, but it's been delayed, I believe, until next, until like February, I think is what they're giving. There were some recommendations already put out for the removal of certain neonics on that, but I'm not going to go into that particularly. Again, not really my area of expertise, so I'll let other people handle that. But this particular slide does address where my comfort zone is, and that has to do with habitat. And really, this sort of sums up a million different studies that have been done, and they really find that the amount of suitable habitat is the main driver of pollination potential in agroecosystems. It's as succinct and simple as I can put it. So it's got to be suitable habitat. Melissa was talking about the work that we're doing looking at fragmentation, and I'll address that as well, because not only does it have to be suitable, but it has to be kind of connected to each other so that you can have movement and things like that going on. Here in Ag Canada, we've been producing a report on the wildlife habitat capacity of ag lands for a number of years. We actually have an updated version of this coming out like any day now. But overall, a surprise to no one that the capacity of ag lands really to provide ecological services beyond food production is in decline, and has been in decline for quite some time. So what we did was we took a look at different habitat. We looked at the use and value of those land cover types to almost 600 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, and took a look at what the different land uses could provide to the wildlife. Finding, of course, cropland can really only provide for about 13% of animals for their food and breeding purposes. Whereas what's qualified as marginal land, so riparian areas, pastures, go back, things like that, can actually provide those important resources for about 75%. But overall, our ability to provide resources to anything beyond food production continues to go down, which is concerning, to say the least. So when we're talking about habitat, at least when we're looking at bees, they need some, well, really it's kind of simple stuff, right? They need suitable nesting habitat. Now you know that about 80% of our bees are ground nesters, so they need undisturbed, untilled soil, which can be at a premium in these agricultural areas. And they need suitable overwintering substrate, again, that is not disturbed. They need access to season-long forage, right? Different bees fly at different times of the year, and when they're up and about, they need flowers to be there. Spring is often a really challenging time, but what's interesting is that's when they shift to trees, shrubs, things like that, dandelions. They do use weeds. We might not like them, but bees will kind of take whatever they can get, right? So when you're thinking about multi-species shelter belts and things like that, don't overlook those trees and shrubs. It's really important. Yeah, so they need they need protection from threats. Those threats being tillage and pesticides. There are lots of studies out that are showing the basics of what happens when you till. Basically, those areas that are more towards the zero till in the rotation have about 5 times more bees in the area, and you reduce your tillage. So with reference to food for these bees, people often say, well, come on, we've got these mass flowering crops, right? But this particular diagram shows canola. And canola, only blooms for a really short period of time. And when you think about this shows you different types of bees and when they fly and when they need food. And if they were relying just on canola, then that would be a real issue. And you could overlay, say, when does flax bloom, sort of things like that. But really you get the idea that a lot of crops are blooming around the same time period there. And so we need the native vegetation and flowering vegetation in place when our bees are out flying. So when we're talking about habitat fragmentation, one thing, I made reference to the fact that insect pollinated crop yields are not keeping up with in relation to sort of innovations from technology. And this was something I found really interesting when they started looking at canola, because they were seeing dips in yield right in the center of their canola crops. And that dip in yield couldn't be explained by soil fertility or wind patterns or water movement through the field, like nothing. And it came down to, quite simply, bees will only fly so far from their nest. So when you are a ground nesting bee, you don't want to go too far from your nest. And depending on your body size, different bees fly different distances. Honeybees in this instance are kind of little kamikazes. They'll fly like 5 kilometers, right? And they've done studies on our wild bees, and what's kind of interesting is they take a look at the distance between essentially their shoulder blades, like in between their wing space, and they can do all kinds of math. Don't ask me, I'm not good at math that way, but they've done the modeling to show the maximum distance that those particular sizes of bees will fly. And again, that's maximum. They don't want to fly that far, because the longer the trip is, the fewer trips they can make and the more vulnerable they are to predation or weather or any type of issue when they're out there flying around. So really these are the maximum distances, but you'd probably cut those in half. So when you're taking a look at, say, small bees or medium bees, it's 400 meters from the edge of a canola field right to the middle. Well, they're just simply not going to fly that far. I haven't finished my analysis yet, but a project that I finished up this past fiscal year, we had cups on the outside of canola fields and then cups at 10 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters, and 400 meters. Because what we wanted to look at is, specifically in Manitoba, which bees are flying into your canola crops. And it's pretty dramatic how few bees actually make it into the center, you know, because these crops are tilled, and so they are not nesting within the crop. They have to come from the margins. And if you're relying on those bees to fly in, you're just not going to get as many bees, of course, in the center. It's too far to fly. They're going to stick to the margins. They're just not going to go that far because they wouldn't survive. And this becomes important when we start talking about the overall landscape and where habitat is located within your watershed. Because not only do you have to think about how far they're going to fly into the field, but you know, these linear features like roadways, which we're going to get into, become really important refugia and traveling corridors and movement corridors for these pollinators to get from one field to the other. The important thing is, right, you want them in the area when you have an insect-dependent crop. So you need to protect these habitat fragments and try and join them together to give as good a chance as possible for those pollinators. So I flashed this this map up before just because I think it's really important. It's kind of small, but you can see right in the center of Manitoba there, with this red spot being, yeah, habitat capacity of the Red River Valley is pretty low for wildlife, which is shocking to none. But one thing we're trying to develop through this project and through others is to see whether or not we can use habitat as a proxy for how much pollination you can expect in that area. Because one thing we simply cannot do is just, you know, constantly go out and sample the bees, right? To find out how many bees you have in the area, and then to give you recommendations on how to support them, simply because it's very time intensive. And you don't want to be killing bees to study them. We need to find an indicator for these pollinators that's accurate, repeatable, it can be relevant on many scales. And yeah, we just can't rely on sampling and expert opinion. I mentioned Dr. Gibbs. He's a really busy man. And we're trying to support him and his grad students to produce more of Dr. Gibbs. And there's also Corey Sheffield, Dr. Sheffield. He's based in Regina and has been really important, you know, on prairie research. But we simply cannot do that type of sampling. So we need to come up with a way of letting people know what you have in your area without having to go in and sample the bees. Now, Environment Canada has taken a stab at this with the Pollination Potential Indicator. So what they've tried to do is take a look at everything from soil type, habitat availability, all this kind of stuff to produce this particular map. There is a model called Invest, which is down in the States. So we've learned quite a bit from them. But these models are not perfect. We're working to, you know, see how applicable they are here in Manitoba. On this particular map, red is actually good, blue not so good. Again, the Red River Valley doesn't show a lot of pollinator potential, which becomes concerning if you're growing crops that need pollinators, right? We're producing similar maps for each watershed, and perhaps by the spring we'll have some more of those to share with you that show specifically within the Swan watershed where you have high pollinator needs with low pollinator potential. And those will be areas that we'll perhaps target for the roadside vegetation management or habitat installations, or, you know, working with those producers to perhaps increase that pollinator potential. So yeah, not surprising, we show low pollination service potential in areas that have higher intensity land use. Comes down to that tillage, right? And once you start tilling intensively, you just don't have the bees. Habitat's gone, food's gone, nesting substrate's gone. So as part of this, we're looking at different methods of assessing habitat. There's this fantastic organization down in the States called Xerxes. named after the first butterfly that humans were responsible for its demise, which is kind of depressing, but still it's a great organization. They do a ton of research on all invertebrates, really, even mollusks and things like that, which when you start looking at clams, as water pollution indicators, it's a whole other depressing topic. Anyway, so Xerxes does a lot of this type of stuff. So we're validating their habitat assessment here in Manitoba. You know, it has some great attributes to it. You know, you look at vegetation zones, you look at the availability of forage in spring, summer, and fall. You look at the nesting habitat, and then you look at farm management practices. So we'll be doing these assessments in various areas in Swan and then our other living labs, watersheds, and part of it we do in the office, where we produce maps that look like this. So we break it down by land use, and then what we would do is go in and start doing vegetation surveys in these green and purple areas to take a look at, okay, well, this shows that it has potential for resources for bees. So what does it have in the spring, summer, and fall? What does the nesting habitat look like? Things like that. You know, this one has quite a bit of habitat in it, simply because this is sort of a pasture land. This is right in Brandon, actually. That's why it's called the Rifle Range. It's over by MBFI pastures, that type of stuff. If you take a look at this particular map, unfortunately is quite common in some of the areas where we were setting up our sampling plots, where you start to look around and go, oh man, there just really is not a lot out there for the bees to eat. And if they're trying to make a living, it could be pretty challenging. And so from an ag perspective, if you're trying to grow a crop that needs insects, they're simply not going to be there for you, because there's just nothing for them to eat. So yeah, what we do again is go in and look at those green areas, and then provide some management recommendations to the producer in the area, and see what we can do to increase the habitat in that area. So when you think about overall biodiversity or pollinators, I like to ask people, so what have you noticed? You know, when I talk about declines, I can talk about what we're seeing in sampling and things like that, but we're always interested in hearing from producers. What have you noticed? You know, one thing that there's a cartoon that goes around quite frequently where people point out how few insects are on your windshield anymore. And that's, it's pretty dramatic how different it is driving the roads, right? Where you just don't see the kills on your windshield anymore because the insects simply aren't there. But yeah, we're interested in hearing what your opinion is, and what you've seen, and the trends or things that have made you kind of look around and go, something's going on here that might not be so good. So when we're talking about supporting pollinators, so, you know, I've tried to tell you a bit about they're in decline. These are some of the pressures on them. You know, this is why we need habitat in these areas. One thing we do recognize is that ag landscapes are working landscapes. So any of our proposed solutions do have to be practical and economically viable, right? You need to see a benefit, you know, either that bump in pollination or perhaps the other benefits, as I mentioned, carbon sequestration, erosion control, things like that. You know, at least you want to be assured that you're not going to be damaging your crop either through exposure to increased pest numbers or things like that. And we really need to look at those stacked benefits on there. And we do like to point out to people is that that this habitat can take on multiple forms. We don't think that anyone is going to take valuable land out of production simply for the sake of pollinators. So what we need to do is have habitat installations that work for your whole operation, right? So, you know, these are just some of the suggestions out there. Cover crops, you know, that's some of what we're looking at in living labs, is to see like how can those provide benefits. I mentioned shelter belts. You know, sometimes shelter belts are popular, sometimes not so much, but if you are considering a shelter belt, you know, consider putting in different types of flowering shrubs, trees, things like that. But I point out even non-flowering ones have benefits in terms of drift protection from pesticides and things like that. So there are a lot of different options out there. Not only that, you know, there are lots of flexible options in terms of what you put down, right? I mentioned the cover crops. There are different types of cover crops that are flowering. It doesn't have to be pure native. Yeah, I'm pushing the native because that's really important. But we also understand that sometimes it does need to be more of an agronomic mix. So we've been working on coming up with those mixes to tailor them to each watershed and then have some flexibility within that. In Manitoba, we struggle a bit with availability of flowering seed. We just don't have a huge demand for it. For example, in Alberta, when any type of construction goes on, oil and gas development, all that kind of stuff, they must put back in what they took out. So that has provided a real great incentive for production of native seed. We just don't have that quite as much here. But we're working on that, you know, increasing that capacity, and we're looking at things like sandfoin, etc., to work into different rotations to, you know, perhaps you're going to mow it after they've bloomed, things like that. But yeah, there are all kinds of different options for it. We do understand that that there are challenges with putting in this type of a flowering mix, you know, and so we've been looking at the different types of equipment and how you get it in there, and you know, again, trying to come up with mixes that flower from April to September. But we have that challenge with finding the seed. The seed is often fluffy, small. It's really hard to put out there. And it takes a long time to grow, right? Sometimes, you know, when you're doing this, you want to see a little bit more of an immediate result that we don't sometimes get with native seed. So a lot of times we throw in some other stuff in there. You know, we have some partners that are doing some really innovative things like highways with their purple prairie clover, and I'll make some reference to that. Yeah, when we were trying to plant, we had some fun stuff with just trying to get that seed in the ground. We picked some really dry years. Well, we didn't pick it, they picked us, right? And then having problems with deer and pocket gophers and ground squirrels. So these are all things that we're trying to take into consideration when we make these recommendations, and, you know, see what we can do. Plant choice, again, we're working on it. One thing that's really advantageous for us here is that there's a Dr. Diana Bezecki-Robson. She's at the Manitoba Museum. She's done some fantastic Manitoba-based work where she's looking directly at which flowers bees use. The important thing about that is it helps us tailor our mixes to make sure we're getting the best bang for your buck. Right? If you're buying really expensive seed, you want to make sure that that seed is the best possible seed you can put out there. And we work closely. One of our colleagues, May Elsinger, she's a botanist and has some great personal experience with getting these in the ground. And yeah, Lena Xerxes, there's other folks out there that they're trying to answer the same questions as us, right? So we really try to look around, and some of these resources are listed on the flyer that I gave to Cliff that he'll pass out. This is just an example of the habitat mix that we used when we were testing our plots. So I think this is included in that resources that I provided to Cliff that he'll send to you. So one thing we always like to ask people, have you tried pollinator plantings before? And what was good about it? What was hard about it? Or what stopped you from trying, right? You know, we're trying to figure this out, but if you have experience with it, we really want to know, you know, what's worked? Oh, why didn't it work? Or what did you like about it? that type of stuff. So this question is on the questionnaire, and as I said, we really want to know what you've tried, because sure, we've done some, but I know there are a lot of people out there that are looking at this and have incorporated plots into either their farmyard or other places. So we want to know what you've tried. So I mentioned that we're looking at the management of roadside vegetation, and I've tried to build the case for it, you know, for pollinator friendly habitat on those roadsides, that their food supply, our food supply is at risk. Pollinators are in decline, and those roadsides can act as corridors and refugia for pollinators. And so within the living labs, we're looking at that landscape connectivity, and you know, we initiated originally discussions just with our Upper Oak watershed, and we've since expanded that quite a bit because there's just really good support and interest from a lot of different people on this, because you know, we're not the only ones that are aware of these issues. And so we're trying to figure out how can we all work together, because we do understand that roadsides you know, are an area where there's a lot going on, right? Because those ditches are used to carry water. There's haying going on in there. We want to make sure that they're, again, not refugia for weeds, pests, all that kind of stuff. So we need to make sure that our management recommendations take into consideration all of those competing uses for them. Really, all we're trying to do in these areas is boost any benefits, ancillary benefits, that perhaps they might not have been the target of why those roadsides are there, but maybe we can get some benefits from them. So what we're trying to do is take a look at that roadside management that's already going on within different watersheds. You know, when do you mow? How do you mow? Why do you mow? Where you mow? Like that type of method to your madness, and how do you map that out? And then perhaps can we look at what type of plants are there, and can we improve them simply by tweaking when you mow or your approach to mowing. So part of this is, as I said, reviewing what's already going on, and then taking a look at doing some inventories, and then mapping out those areas, not just in the roadsides, but the areas adjacent to the roadsides, to give us a good idea of where are there kind of bigger pieces of habitat and how connected are they rather. And we want to look at what are the high priority areas for your watershed. You know, do you have particular targets within your watershed plan that could be addressed by this roadside vegetation management? And yeah, look at project guidance or management guidance from the RMs. And then as we go through this, initiate some projects with the surrounding landowners. So we initially started out just targeting the biodiversity thing, but we also want to take a look at how do these management recommendations change any type of water movement. Again, we don't want to be impacting ditches that are important for that. And we want to look at water quality changes. You know, can we improve the water quality of the runoff simply by having these filtration strips of more robust native vegetation, so that the water that is moving through the ditches is cleaner? And can we perhaps have impact overall on the nutrient values of the runoff on the watershed? Oh, this looks to be a repeat, but yeah, how we're going to do this for the vegetation inventories, we're taking a look at a few nifty options. There's this thing called the collector that turns your phone into a GPS unit. We're going to do some training with whoever wants it in terms of identifying native vegetation. Yeah, identify those other habitats, and start to prioritize those areas to look at doing some specific planting. So the first thing we always try to do is manage what's there, improve what's there, but then now we need to perhaps look at putting some in place. So this is kind of where we're at right now, is that we're surveying the different RMs and we're pulling together a working group. We've had a couple meetings, but we've got more people coming on board all the time, which is fantastic, because, you know, we need to be we need to have as many people around the table as possible so we're not missing anything. We don't want to get in trouble with regulatory. We don't want to be encouraging noxious weeds. Those won't make us very popular. So these are some of the recommendations that have been used in other jurisdictions. Again, on this, we're not the first ones to look at these areas and see their potential. So there have been quite a few pilots down in the States that we can learn from. They've tried all kinds of different mowing regimes, timing of mowing, delaying mowing, reducing herbicide use, you know, using sheep or goat. You never know what we might do with that. Prescribed burns, those are always fun, but we'll have to see about those. Biological control agents, you know, leafy spurge, not a fun topic. And there have been quite a few studies looking at spurge beetles and things like that. So we can use those to inform what we're doing here and perhaps introduce some of those beetles into different areas that we identify as really being out of control with leafy spurge and need some specific attention. So yeah, moving forward, we are going to work with our different working groups, do everything from roadside signage. I know that there is a school group on this talk right now. That might be something that we could partner with, right? Where adopt a roadway. So never mind picking up garbage. Maybe you want to plant some flowers and monitor some of those pollinators. There's some real potential there. Do more of these workshops. As we learn more about what we want to do in those areas, we can start to help people out in a broader sense, and or perhaps target certain landowners if we identify that they're a key stepping stone that we might want to add in the connectingness of those areas. We might want to target high profile sites so that people know what we're doing, right? Rest areas, memorial sites, things like that, so that we can put up some signage, increase people's understanding and awareness, get them to ask some questions and understand what we're trying to do. So I've talked quite a bit about what we know. These are some of the things we don't know. We're still developing those baseline maps of pollinators. We still need to get a better handle exactly on impact of tillage, you know, in terms of how often can you till before you really, you know, kick the snot out of your pollinators. How deep tillage, you know, is strip tillage going to see different impacts, things like that. That threshold of disturbance, how much habitat is enough? You know, the figure of 30% is tossed around, but more studies are showing that's very context dependent, right? And some areas need more, some areas might need less. And again, that the appropriate seed mixes and ones that are successful to make sure that what we're recommending to people is what the bees need and also what is achievable and available here in Manitoba. Woo! There you go, guys. We talked a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Mel.
Sharing.
Thanks, Mel. You did a great job. It's always fascinating, just kind of blows my mind. Thanks, Melissa, as well.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions here. The first one, bee decline related 99% due to loss of habitat, pesticide use, what else?
So the climate change, really, so that's up there. Yeah, pesticides, habitat loss, transmission of disease and pathogens from managed bees are the big ones that are identified.
So second question here, so take home message being have a natural area, plant flowers, leave your leaves. What about chemical use for homeowners? What chemicals become part of the tissue of the plant versus just staying on the surface?
Well, you know, I did say my area of expertise is not in neonics, but neonics are a systemic poison. So what it does is that actually gets into the nectar and the pollen of the plant. And so then what they do is that they eat it and they ingest it and they feed it to young. Studies have shown that plants and natural plants on the margins of fields that have been treated with neonics show lethal and sublethal amounts of neonics up to 5 years after application, and quite a ways from it because they're highly mobile in the waterways and in the soil. So when I say lethal and sublethal impacts, sometimes it kills them outright if perhaps they've been dosed directly with it. Although in Manitoba, a lot of what we're seeing is, of course, treated seed, right? So it comes up in the plant. So it's not so much lethal on them, it's when they eat it. Sublethal impacts is they lose a bit of their ability to navigate. So that means they have a much harder time finding the flowers that they need and finding their way back to their nest reliably and efficiently. And then, of course, as I said, they're feeding it to their young in those pollen balls. And so you reduce the overall fitness of the larvae and the babies that are produced. From a homeowner perspective, you may not be aware of this, but a lot of times bedding plants, etc., are pre-treated with neonics. They'll have a little tag in with the plant that says, you know, oh, as a benefit, these are, you know, resistant to aphids, mealworms, yada, yada, all that kind of stuff. What that actually translates into is that they have been pre-treated with a neonic, so they will impact your bees as well.
Great. Cliff, you had a question about a list of flowering versus non-flowering plants, shrubs, trees, etc. Did you want to sort of expand on your question? Were you sort of asking whether or not there was an official list of beneficial flowering versus non-flowering plants, or kind of what did you mean there?
Yeah, I think like I love this idea because everybody can do something. You know, if you're a municipality, you can manage your roadways, your public spaces. But really, if you have a tiny parcel of land that you're associated with, you know, you could have trees, shrubs, grasses, that area. But I wonder if that list is out there. You know, I guess most plants will create a flower, but not all. And what are the most beneficial ones? And maybe Mel already shared that material. I'm not sure.
That the list that we used for Brandon is in that handout that I gave you, Cliff. And then within the pollinator resources, there's a link to the Pollinator Partnership Canada. They're fantastic, and they have ecoregion specific planting guides. So they have Aspen Parkland and they have Manitoba Lowlands. I think the Aspen Parkland is the one that's most applicable for the western part of the province. And they got everything you need in there. So go to the Pollinator Partnership Canada and you can get it. You can get those lists from them. Xerxes has it too. You would look for the upper Midwest. So just, you know, I mean, they're a US based company. So they kind of stop at the border, but the upper Midwest is what we've used as resources. And as I said, though, that handout, it's got those on there. It was developed for our project with the flowering period, etc., because you want various shapes of flowers and various colors as well, because different bees like different colors, and some bees like different colors throughout the growing season. So you want that mix in there. So that's in there as well.